The winter of 945 after Christ brought the worst storms Norway had seen in living memory. And I want you to picture this for a moment, not some romantic Viking village with roaring fires and endless feasts. No, picture instead a Norwegian longhouse, timber walls groaning against winds that howl down from the Arctic with a fury that makes modern blizzards look like mild weather advisories. Inside that longhouse, Astrid Thorsdottir sat watching her 3 children huddle near a fire that was dying because they were running out of fuel. Running out of everything, really. Her youngest son, Eric, maybe 7 years old, wore a tunic so threadbare you could practically see through it. And Astrid, whose fingers were already raw and cracked from endless spinning, ran her hands across that worn wool and did the math. The terrible, inescapable math that every medieval mother knew by heart. 200 hours, minimum. That is what it would take to create a single replacement tunic using the traditional methods her grandmother Ingrid had taught her. The sacred methods, the only methods anyone knew. Now, 200 hours might not sound like much to us. That is what 5 weeks of a modern 40-hour work week. But understand what 200 hours meant to a Viking Age woman. That is 200 hours at a vertical loom, while also managing a household, preserving food, caring for children, helping with the fishing, everything else that survival demanded, and that is for one tunic. She had 3 children, each growing, each needing clothes that would not fall apart before spring. The vertical loom in the corner of her longhouse stood like an ancient guardian. You have to understand what these looms represented. They were not just tools. They were sacred objects, passed down through generations of women, their warp-weighted threads demanding months of devotion for a single piece of clothing. The setup alone took days. Threading the heddles, hanging the weights, getting the tension exactly right. And then the real work began. Back and forth, building fabric one thread at a time through the howling Norwegian winter. That particular night, and you can almost hear the wind screaming through those timber walls. Astrid did something that was either desperate or inspired, or maybe both. She made an offering to Frigg, goddess of the loom. This was standard practice. What was not standard was what she asked for. She pricked her finger, mixed her blood with sacred herbs the way her grandmother had taught her, and instead of requesting strength for the traditional way, she asked for wisdom to find a new path. The answer came not in some mystical dream or divine vision. It came from watching her husband Bjorn repair his fishing net. And here is where you see the mind that is about to change everything. Bjorn was not just randomly patching holes. He was creating strength through diagonal reinforcement rather than straight lines. The net could flex, could give, could handle stress in ways that rigid straight-line construction never could. Astrid looked at that net. Then she looked at the traditional tunic construction hanging on the wall, rectangles of cloth sewn together, straight lines, rigid patterns, and she started doing the math again. Different math this time. Dangerous math. See, the traditional tunic pattern wasted fabric. Lots of it. You would weave these large rectangular pieces, then you would cut them, then you would sew them together, and in the cutting, you lost precious material. Material that represented hours and hours of labor, and the seaming all that hand sewing added weeks more work. What if the very pattern itself could be reimagined? Her first attempts failed spectacularly, and I mean spectacularly. The village women gathered to watch what they were already calling Astrid's Folly, led by Gudrun Ironfingers, and you have to love that name, the master, weaver, whose family had been teaching the traditional methods for 3 generations. 3 centuries of Norse textile tradition, all of it saying that Astrid was wrong. The new cutting pattern she attempted used triangular gauze inserted into the body rather than rectangular side panels. To the village women, this looked insane. It defied everything they knew, everything their mothers had taught them, everything that had worked for as long as anyone could remember. And remember, in medieval societies, because this is how we have always done it, was not just tradition, it was survival. It was the accumulated wisdom of generations who had figured out what worked in this harsh, unforgiving environment. But Astrid persisted, while her children grew thinner, while winter deepened its grip, while the other women whispered that she was endangering her family by refusing to weave the proper way. Her mathematical mind kept calculating angles and proportions, testing, failing, adjusting, testing again. And here is what makes this story remarkable. Astrid was not some isolated genius working in secret. She was a desperate mother, very publicly failing, surrounded by skeptics who had every reason to believe she was wrong. The pressure must have been crushing. Every day she spent on her experiments was a day she was not producing clothing the traditional way. Every failure made the whispers louder. Every cold night with her children made the weight of responsibility heavier. But sometimes, just sometimes, desperation combined with intelligence produces something revolutionary, something that changes everything. And as that brutal winter finally began to ease, as the storms slowly lessened their grip on Sognefjord, Astrid Thorsdottir was about to do exactly that. The question was, would anyone listen? Spring brought the annual Thing assembly to Trondheim, and if you do not know what a Thing was, picture a combination of county fair, court of law, religious festival, and political convention all rolled into one. This was where disputes were settled, laws were made, marriages were arranged, and reputations were built or destroyed. And word of Astrid's strange experiments had spread through the fjords like wildfire. Gudrun Ironfingers demanded a formal challenge. Now, understand what this meant. In Norse society, a challenge before the Thing was not some casual competition. This was serious business. The stakes that Gudrun proposed were devastating. If Astrid lost, she would be forbidden from weaving for 3 years. 3 years. That was essentially a death sentence for her family. They would fall into poverty, become dependent on charity, lose their standing in the community. If she won, her method would receive official recognition. The Jarl's wife herself, Thorun the Golden-Handed, would judge the contest. The challenge rules were simple yet brutal. Each woman had 7 days to produce a complete tunic from raw wool to finished garment. Everything: shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing, 7 days. The crowd gathered each morning to watch, and this was not some polite audience. People were wagering silver and livestock on the outcome. Fortunes were being made and lost on which weaver would triumph. Gudrun worked the traditional way, and watching her must have been like watching a master violinist perform. Her movements were a prayer of practiced perfection, each step exactly as her grandmother's grandmother had taught. The rhythm of her work had a kind of terrible beauty to it. This was 300 years of accumulated wisdom moving through her hands, every motion economical, every technique proven. She was not just weaving a tunic, she was demonstrating why tradition deserved respect. Astrid's approach looked chaotic. She spun her thread differently, creating varying thicknesses for different purposes, thicker for structural areas, finer for flexibility. Her loom setup defied convention, with additional heddle rods that allowed complex diagonal weaving. To the traditionalists watching, it looked wrong. It looked like someone who did not know what she was doing, but a few observers, the sharper ones, began to notice something. Astrid was moving faster, not rushing, not cutting corners, but genuinely accomplishing more in less time. On the 4th day, disaster struck. Someone, Astrid never discovered who, though suspicion fell on several of Gudrun's more fervent supporters, had loosened the weights on her loom during the night. Hours of work, maybe 20 hours of careful weaving, had unravelled into a tangled mess. The crowd that morning expected to see Astrid's defeat, expected to see her break down, perhaps beg for mercy, certainly abandon her foolish innovations. Instead, she adapted. And this is where you see the difference between someone who memorizes techniques and someone who truly understands the underlying principles. Astrid incorporated the damaged section into a revolutionary reinforced shoulder design, using the very setback to create something stronger than what she had originally planned. That reinforced shoulder construction would later become standard across Scandinavia, but in that moment, on day 4, it was just a desperate woman refusing to quit. Thorun the Golden-Handed watched everything with sharp eyes. She was not just some decorative royal consort, she was a power in her own right, a woman who managed vast estates and trade networks, and she noticed when Astrid's strange triangular cutting pattern used 90% of the cloth compared to the traditional 70%, 90% versus 70%. Think about that. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between poverty and prosperity, between barely surviving and actually thriving. The fifth day revealed Astrid's true genius. While Gudrun meticulously hand-sewed each seam with tiny, time-consuming stitches, and those stitches were beautiful, understand, they were the work of a master craftsperson. Astrid employed a running stitch technique reinforced at stress points. She had borrowed this from sail-making, where seams had to be both fast to produce and strong enough to handle incredible forces. The technique created stronger seams in half the time. The gathered crowd began to murmur. Even Gudrun's supporters could see that Astrid's tunic was taking shape far faster than should be possible. By the evening of day 5, Astrid was actually ahead. Her tunic was not quite finished, but she had more done than Gudrun, and this was the thing that really disturbed people. It looked like it was going to work. It looked like it was going to be a real, functional, durable tunic. Day 6 was tense. Both women worked from dawn until the light failed, their hands moving in their respective rhythms. Gudrun's steady and traditional, Astrid's innovative and quick. The crowd had grown. People were arriving from neighboring settlements, word having spread that something important was happening. This was not just about 2 tunics anymore. This was about whether the old ways would hold or whether change was possible. On the morning of day 7, both women presented their finished work to Thorun the Golden-Handed. Gudrun's tunic was flawless by every traditional standard. The weave was perfect. The seams were invisible. The construction was exactly as it should be. Astrid's tunic looked different. Sharper angles, visible reinforcements at the shoulders, that strange triangular gore construction. But when Thorun examined it, really examined it, she found something remarkable. It was not just as strong as the traditional construction. It was stronger, and it had taken less than half the time to produce. Thorun's judgment was careful and diplomatic. She praised Gudrun's mastery of traditional techniques, acknowledging that her work represented the finest of what 3 centuries of Norse weavers had achieved. Then she turned to Astrid, and what she said next changed everything. Sometimes the gods give us new wisdom not to shame the old ways, but to help us survive new challenges. Astrid Thorsdottir's method is recognized as legitimate before this thing. The crowd's reaction was mixed cheers from some, angry muttering from others. But the die was cast. The challenge was over. And Astrid had won not just her right to weave, but official recognition of a method that was about to spread across the Norse world like wildfire. But winning the challenge? That was just the beginning. By autumn of 946, news of Astrid's victory at the Thing had reached every Norse settlement from Iceland to the Rus trading posts of Kiev, and you have to understand how remarkable this was. We are talking about a time before printing presses, before mass communication, before anything we would recognize as modern media. Yet somehow, within 6 months, every trading post, every market, every gathering of Norse people was talking about the weaver from Sognefjord, who had beaten Gudrun Ironfingers and changed the rules. The Jarl of Trondheim, Eric Bloodaxe, and yes, that was actually his name, which tells you something about the era we are discussing, summoned Astrid to demonstrate the technique for his warband's preparation. And here is where the story gets really interesting from a practical standpoint. Eric Bloodaxe needed 200 warriors outfitted with new tunics before the spring raids on Northumbria, 200 complete sets of clothing for men who were about to spend months on longships and in foreign lands. Using traditional methods, this would require 40 women working all winter. 40. And these were not women who could just focus on weaving. They had households to run, children to raise, food to preserve, all the endless work that kept a Norse settlement alive. Finding 40 women with the time and skill to complete this work was actually a significant logistical challenge. Astrid promised completion with just 15 women in 3 months. The Jarl's advisors thought she was insane. Some openly laughed. But Eric Bloodaxe was a practical man, and Thorun the Golden-Handed had vouched for Astrid's methods. So he agreed, with one condition. If she failed, she would personally reimburse the cost of purchasing the tunics from Frankish traders. Given that this would have bankrupted her family for generations, the stakes could not have been higher. The training sessions in the Jarl's Great Hall became legendary. Young women arrived from distant steadings, bringing payment of silver, amber, and precious soapstone. Astrid's first 12 students, later known as the Needle Sisters, included her own daughter Freydis, who would eventually carry the technique to the Greenland settlements. And what Astrid taught them was not just mechanical process. She taught them the mathematics behind it, understanding proportions, calculating fabric needs, adapting patterns for different body types. This is important. Astrid was not creating factory workers who mindlessly followed instructions. She was creating teachers who understood the principles and could innovate further. Each of the Needle Sisters would go on to train others, and each would adapt the technique to their local conditions and materials. This was not just technology transfer. This was the creation of a knowledge network that would span the Norse world. The work proceeded at a pace that astounded observers. By the end of the first month, the 15 weavers had completed 60 tunics. 60. Using traditional methods, they might have managed 20. The quality was exceptional. Eric Bloodaxe himself wore one of the first completed pieces on a winter hunting expedition and reported that it performed better in harsh conditions than his traditionally made clothing. The economic transformation was immediate and staggering. Think about what this meant for a typical Norse village. Before Astrid, a significant portion of women's labour, we are talking hundreds of hours per family per year, was locked into basic clothing production. After, that time became available for other activities. Villages that adopted Astrid's method could outfit trading expeditions twice as fast, giving them crucial advantages in the competitive Baltic markets. The silver that would have purchased finished tunics from Frankish traders now stayed in Norse hands. This was huge. The Norse economy had always been partially dependent on imported cloth and finished goods. Suddenly, that dependency decreased. Women who previously spent entire winters at their looms suddenly had time for other crafts: leatherworking, jewelry making, brewing, tablet weaving for decorative elements. The diversification of these settlements' economies was remarkable. But here is something that historians often overlook. The technique influenced military strategy itself. Raiding parties could now replace damaged clothing quickly during campaigns, extending their range and duration. A war band could bring along an Astrid-trained weaver, and suddenly they had the ability to outfit themselves from captured materials. This was a strategic advantage that completely changed the calculus of long-distance expeditions. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014, this is 68 years after Astrid's original innovation, saw Irish defenders puzzled by Norse warriors who seemed to have endless supplies of fresh tunics. The Irish had expected the Norse to show wear and tear from a long campaign. Instead, they looked fresh, well-equipped, ready for extended fighting. The Irish did not know that Astrid-trained weavers were travelling with the army, producing replacements from captured materials, from local wool, from whatever they could find. By 960, there were documented training centres in at least 12 major Norse settlements: Bergen, Dublin, York, Hedeby, Birka, Novgorod. Everywhere the Norse traded or settled, the technique spread. And it kept evolving. Dublin's Hiberno-Norse community incorporated Irish decorative techniques while maintaining Astrid's efficient construction. Icelandic weavers modified the pattern for their particularly thick, oily wool. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople, Norse warriors serving the Byzantine emperor, amazed Byzantine chroniclers with their ability to maintain distinctly Norse dress despite being thousands of miles from home. What started as one desperate mother's innovation in a freezing Norwegian longhouse had become a defining characteristic of Norse culture. The technique gave Norse society a competitive advantage in trade, in military campaigns, in simple survival, and it all happened within a single generation. But what about Astrid herself? What happened to the woman who started all of this? 50 years after that desperate winter in Sognefjord, Astrid's innovation had fundamentally reshaped Norse society, and this is the part of the story that really drives home the magnitude of what she accomplished. We are not talking about a minor improvement to existing techniques. We are talking about a revolution that changed the basic economics and logistics of an entire civilization. Astrid's granddaughter Sigrid established the first true textile guild in Hedeby around 995. And when I say true guild, I mean an organization with standardized practices, quality control, apprenticeship systems, and pricing agreements. Before this, Norse textile production was a household activity, highly variable in quality and output. After, it became an organized industry. Sigrid introduced standardized sizing, another of Astrid's innovations that often gets overlooked. Before standardization, every garment was custom-made for a specific person. A merchant could not just buy tunics for trade because nobody knew if they would fit the eventual buyer. But, with standardized sizes, suddenly merchants could order 20 tunics in middle size and know exactly what they would receive. The guild's records, preserved on birch bark and later transcribed by Christian monks, show that by 995, over 3,000 women across the Norse world were using the Astrid method. 3,000. Let that sink in. 3,000 trained practitioners of a technique that one woman developed out of desperation just 50 years earlier. That is a spread rate that rivals modern social media in terms of how quickly an innovation can propagate through a society. And remember, this is happening in an era where information traveled at the speed of a horse or a longship. The technique adapted brilliantly to new environments as Vikings expanded their reach. In Iceland's sheep-rich landscape, where the wool was thicker and greasier than Norwegian wool, weavers modified the pattern to account for different fabric weights and behaviors. They developed variations that worked better with the local materials, while maintaining the core efficiency of Astrid's design. Dublin's Hiberno-Norse community. These were Vikings who had settled in Ireland and intermarried with the locals, incorporated Irish decorative techniques. They added elaborate interlace patterns, used different colours, employed local dyeing methods. But underneath all that decoration, the construction was pure Astrid method. Fast, efficient, material conserving. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople presented perhaps the most dramatic example of the technique's reach. These were Norse warriors serving the Byzantine emperor, thousands of miles from Scandinavia, surrounded by Greek and Roman textile traditions that were arguably more advanced in many ways. Yet they maintained their Norse dress, and Byzantine chroniclers specifically commented on this. How did they do it? They had Astrid-trained weavers in Constantinople, producing Norse-style clothing using local Byzantine materials. The technique was portable enough to work anywhere wool was available. Archaeological evidence from the Coppergate dig in York, this is a site that was excavated in the 1970s and 80s, revealed something extraordinary. Buried in waterlogged soil that perfectly preserved organic materials, archaeologists found a half-finished tunic from around 970, and when textile experts examined it, they found unmistakable evidence of Astrid's triangular gore construction and reinforced shoulder design. The garment's wool still held traces of woad and madder dye. The distinctive running stitch seaming was perfectly preserved. Even more remarkable was a small lead trial piece showing the cutting pattern. This was essentially a learning tool, a template that an apprentice would have used to practice the pattern before cutting expensive wool. The fact that such teaching tools existed and were being used systematically, that tells us this was not just a technique being passed on informally. This was structured education, probably within a guild system. The human cost of innovation emerged in the sagas, though Astrid herself appeared only briefly in the historical record. The saga of the Needle Women, written around 1100, about 150 years after the events, described how Gudrun Ironfingers eventually became Astrid's strongest advocate. And this is one of my favourite details of the entire story. Gudrun, who had challenged Astrid, who had represented 3 centuries of tradition, who had every reason to remain bitter about her defeat, she ended up teaching the new method to her own daughters. The saga records her words, "The gods give each generation its own wisdom." That is profound. That is someone who was secure enough in their own mastery to recognize when a better way had emerged. Gudrun did not diminish her own accomplishments by embracing Astrid's innovations. If anything, by combining her traditional knowledge with the new techniques, she became even more valuable to her community. Astrid died peacefully in 988, at what was probably a very old age for the time. She would have been in her 70s or even 80s. She was surrounded by 4 generations of weavers, from her elderly students to her great-great-grandchildren. Her funeral ship, according to the saga, carried 100 tunics made by her students, a tribute that would have taken a single traditional weaver 20,000 hours to complete. Think about that, 20,000 hours of work, freely given, to honor a woman who had changed their world. Today, in the Lofoter Viking Museum at Borg in northern Norway, master weaver Marianne Thorsdottir, who claims direct descent from Astrid through her daughter Freydis's line, teaches visitors the revolutionary technique that transformed the Viking world. And when you watch Marianne work, when you see how elegant and simple the method looks, it is easy to forget how revolutionary it once was. The method that established craftswomen once called impossible now seems obviously correct. The triangular gauze that seemed to defy tradition now appear as the natural solution to the problem of efficient fabric use. The reinforced shoulders that came from a moment of desperate adaptation now look like planned genius. But it took one woman's desperate love for her children, combined with a mathematical mind and unshakable determination, to break 3 centuries of tradition and give the Vikings their wings of wool. And here is what really matters. Astrid was not some mythical hero from legend. She was a real person who lived and struggled and innovated during one of history's most dynamic periods. She faced ridicule, opposition, and the very real possibility of destroying her family through her experiments. She persevered not because she was certain of success. Nobody could have been certain, but because the alternative was watching her children freeze. That is the human story at the heart of every great innovation. Not genius descending from on high, but necessity pushing ordinary people to extraordinary solutions. Astrid Thorsdottir took a fundamental technology that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries and revolutionized it in a single generation. She created a knowledge network that spanned continents. She gave her society a competitive advantage that would last for centuries. And it all started with a mother looking at her children's threadbare clothing during the worst winter Norway had seen in living memory, and refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they had always been. Sometimes, that is all it takes to change the world.